zooms, primes. There's so many different lenses out there, and today I want to find out which one is the right one for you. With bird photography and photography in general, the lens is where you want to spend most of your budget. Cameras come and go, and even with an older model camera you can still take really nice images, but if you don't have a good lens, chances are you will not be taking very good images simply because the lens can't deliver the quality that you need. And a great lens will stay with you for at least 5 to 10 years, so it's actually worth the investment. And a great lens as well will hold its value. For instance, my first 600mm lens I bought for $6,000 and sold for $5,750 almost 10 years later. So the lens held the value really well, and I didn't even lose much money on it having the lens for such a long period of time. People often say that with photography, it's all about the photographer and not the gear, which I totally agree with. But at the same time, I think for bird photography, we can make a slight exception. If you're not having a lens that has at least a decent zoom range of like 400 to 600mm or more, you're at a great disadvantage. If you're going around with a 200mm lens trying to get nice frame filling shots of birds, you will have a really hard time. So I think that's something to keep in mind, that while yes, it is the photographer, it's also the equipment when it comes to getting the birds big enough in the frame. Since there's so many different brands and lenses out there, I don't want to recommend one specific lens, but I want to look at the different brands and what I would look for in a lens to hopefully give you an idea of which lens will be the best one for you. Personally, I actually think it's quite a difficult time to buy a lens right at this moment if you're shooting with Nikon or Canon, because both of these brands are just transitioning into the mirrorless sector. So while with Sony they have an established range of lenses for the mirrorless that they're still adding to, both Canon and Nikon are still bringing out a lot of new lenses, new mirrorless lenses over the next few years. So what's there at the moment will be very different in 2 to 3 years. So there's all the old range of lenses like the EF ones for Canon that you can use with an adapter on the new mirrorless cameras, but it is something to keep in mind. Canon, for instance, only has one 100 to 500mm lens that might be interesting for us nature photographers, or the two new lenses that I'll hopefully try out very soon, the 600 or 800mm f11 lens, but at this stage we'll still have to try them out and see if they're actually going to be workable in the field on like a cloudy day like today. So this change to mirrorless is something that I keep in mind with my lens purchases as well, because I don't want to buy a really expensive EF lens for $5,000 or $10,000 that might be not what I want in 2 or 3 years down the road. So that's just something that I keep in mind at the moment. I know it doesn't make the decision any easier, but that's just what it is at the moment with everything transitioning to mirrorless. Do you need expensive equipment to take really nice bird images? No, absolutely not. What you want and what you need really depends on your circumstances, what you want to get out of your images, and whether you want to like publish them or print them really big. The more you want to do with the images, the more important the quality of the images becomes. And also, if you think you might have to do a bit of cropping, then having a really good quality lens will definitely help you. I've made a video on the topic just to show that you don't really need a really expensive lens and camera system to take some really cool images. So check that out, where I compare my setup that's worth around $20,000 to a $2,000 setup and try to get the same kind of looking images, and I think succeeded in the field, showing you that even with a cheap setup you can still take really nice images. So if you ever have the choice between getting a new, better upgraded lens or upgrading to the latest model camera, I would personally always go for the better lens, because in the long run you will definitely get more value out of it. Which lens will ultimately be the best one for you also depends on your circumstances and your style of shooting. Do you want to walk around and handhold your lens, or use a tripod and have a big prime lens? Do you want a zoom for ultimate flexibility, or that bigger prime lens for ultimate image quality? Are you a full frame shooter, or you shoot with a crop camera? All these things should factor into which lens is the right one for you. If you walk around and you're shooting on a crop camera, it's likely that something like a 400mm lens might already be enough for you, whereas if you're shooting full frame and you want maximum image quality, you're not minding to carry around a tripod, I would probably recommend a different lens for you. So really ask yourself, what's my shooting style, what do I want to do, and what do I want to get out of my images. What I also find important is, can I put extenders on a lens? Personally, I really value the ability to put the 1.4 enter 2x extender on my 600mm lens, and this is something where most zoom lenses really struggle. As soon as you put an extender on a zoom lens, the image quality drops down a fair bit and the autofocus slows down as well, and it's just not an overall great experience anymore. So this is where prime lenses really shine, with image quality and the ability to use extenders. So what are some of the features that I look for in a lens? A short minimum focusing distance. The less minimum focusing distance they have, the better. Some of these longer lenses, like an 800mm lens, or also the new Canon 600 and 800mm f11 lenses, they have quite a large minimum focusing distance. That simply means that you have to be 6-7 meters away from a bird before you can actually take a shot. And sometimes, especially if you're hand holding a lens and walking around, you can be much closer to a bird, and what happens then? You look through the viewfinder, try to focus, you can't focus because you're within the minimum focusing distance, and then you have to actually walk back until you can actually take your shot. So that's something that can be quite frustrating at times, and the shorter that distance is, the better. So if I had the choice between two lenses and one lens focuses at 3 meters and the other one at 6 meters, I would be very tempted to go for the lens that already starts focusing at 3 meters for added flexibility and also the ability to get things larger into your viewfinder. What I also want is fast and accurate autofocus. I've used lenses with slow and not so accurate autofocus in the past, and just not fun to use and very frustrating. So crisp and fast autofocus that just jumps onto the subject and stays on the subject is very important to me. Furthermore, I also really want image stabilization in my lenses. Even when I use them on a tripod, it can make a big difference, and also for shooting video it makes a very big difference as well. And especially if you're hand holding your lenses, image stabilization is very important and allows you to take sharp and crisp images much better and much easier. So the ideal bird photography lens would be something like a 100 to 800 f2.8 lens that weighs 1 kilo and delivers amazing image quality. Obviously, we can't have that lens, so we need to find a lens that does what we want at the price that we want and at the weight that we want. So do you like more flexibility with zoom lenses, or the ultimate image quality and extender use with prime lenses? Let me know in the comments. So what's the right focal length for bird photography? I know this is a difficult question, depends on what birds you want to photograph, but generally speaking, I think you would want to get to that magical 600mm number that will give you some nice reach when it comes to getting even some birds that are a bit further away from you, a bit more skittish. I've taken nice images with like a 17 to 40 wide angle lens and some other shorter lenses like a 24 to 70 or 70 to 200. But would I want to use these lenses on an everyday basis to photograph birds? Absolutely not. To consistently get good results, we just need a certain amount of focal length to just get the birds large enough in the frame, because we all know birds like to rather fly away from us than coming really close to us. So what sort of lenses offer us these ranges? There's the typical zoom lenses that a lot of different brands offer us, like a 100 to 400, 100 to 500, 150 to 600. They can be fantastic entries into bird photography and can be fairly inexpensive depending on the brand. The only thing to keep in mind is that, especially with the lens, in a way you kind of get what you pay for. So if you're going for a cheaper zoom lens option, especially if it has a long zoom range, the image quality will likely be a little bit compromised and not as crisp like a nice sort of maybe Canon 100 to 400 version 2. So that's just something to keep in mind. And also if you're shooting in a lot of low light conditions, these zoom lenses won't be your perfect choice, simply because a lot of them end up at like 5.6 or 6.3 or even 7.1. So you will always have to use fairly high ISO with these lenses, especially if you're planning on hand holding them. In saying all that, I don't want to be negative about them. I think they're fantastic lenses, and we all started with one of them. I started with the 100 to 400 version 1 and got some fantastic images with it. However, it was definitely harder to work with that lens than with the big prime lens. But at the same time, I wish I had that flexibility back that I got when I just walked around, handheld a nice little lens rather than having the big tripod and the big heavy lens that I have to carry around all the time. The other category of lenses we can look at is the nice prime lenses. There's also a lot of different offerings from different brands, and generally for bird photography it starts with a 300mm lens, usually a 2.8, and the two extenders that gets you to 420 and 600mm. And then there's a lot of different 400mm options available, like a 2.8 400 that has stunning image quality, great low light ability, and you can also use the two extenders on it that will get you to 560 and 800mm. And beyond that we get to the really specialized lenses, the 500, 600 and 800mm that are heavy, hard to carry around, but give you the ultimate image quality even with the extenders attached, and are, for me, the ultimate when it comes to bird photography. When you look at bird photography, and my bird photography in particular, you will also notice those beautiful, smooth, out of focus backgrounds. And the type of lens you're using is critical in getting these backgrounds. While you can get them with essentially any lens, if you position yourself in the right distance with a distant background to the bird, it is much harder to achieve those backgrounds with a zoom lens or shorter prime lens. Whereas with the big prime lenses like a 5, 6 or 800mm lens, you almost get these backgrounds by default, simply because the depth of field is so small that anything behind the bird will just get blurred and give you that beautiful and lovely looking effect. Personally, the ultimate bird photography lens for me is an f4 600mm. Why that lens? I feel like it's the perfect starting point at 600mm. I get birds that are really close to me or larger birds with just 600mm, but then I can also put the 1.4 extender on to get smaller birds or birds that are a bit further away, essentially without any loss of image quality. And if the bird is really far away, or if I want to zoom in to get like a nice headshot, I can put on the 2x extender and get fantastic image quality still. And that's simply why I personally prefer a prime lens over a zoom lens as my main lens. If I was using a zoom lens, I would just not be able to get to those extreme focal lengths that I use in the field, and that give me a real edge and a real cool look and the ability to get different looking images in the field. Some of you might say, why not a 500 on 800mm lens? Well, 500, I used to have one, but I felt like it was just a little bit too short, and I would always use the 1.4 extender on it. So with the 600, I'm actually not using the extender as much, so I'm getting a bit more image quality, and the weight difference isn't that dramatic anymore that to me it's worth to having that shorter, lighter lens. And 800, it's actually too much for me. I feel like with an 800mm lens, if the birds are close, I'm photographing larger birds, I'm at a duck pond where the birds swim close by, 800 is just too much, and I'm clipping off the tails or the front of the beak, or the bird is just too large in the frame. In those instances, I'm really happy that I can have my 600mm lens without extenders to get those shots where the birds are close. So that's the ultimate bird photography lens for me. What's your ultimate bird photography lens? What's the lens you're currently having? And what's your dream lens? Let me know in the comments right down there. For me, in the Canon lineup, the 600 is definitely the main choice. However, if I was shooting Nikon, I would have a hard time looking past that 5.6 500mm lens that's only like this big, fairly lightweight, and so much easier to handhold and travel with. If I was shooting Sony, I would definitely be looking at that 200 to 600mm lens that seems to have great quality, and you're able to handhold it, and it gives you that nice reach up to that 600mm mark. When it comes to lenses, what I also think is important to note that you don't always have to buy a brand new lens. Especially if you're looking at the prime lenses, they're holding their value really well. So you sometimes can buy a used lens for half the price of a new lens and sell it 5 years down the track for the identical price. As I've shown you in the past, it is ultimately possible to take great images with all kinds of lenses, but having the bigger, more expensive lenses simply makes your life much easier. But would I recommend starting out with a 600mm prime lens? Probably not. I think if you start out with a zoom like 100 to 400, 150 to 600, that gives you a perfect weapon to get out, get the birds that you want and learn about the birds and walk around and study bird behavior, and then you might start to settle on a style of bird photography that will require you to maybe look at upgrading your lens. But in the beginning, I think it's important that you just have a lens that allows you to go out and allows you to take images as you are in the field. If you start off with a big 600mm prime lens, you might actually lose interest in bird photography because you think it's just too hard to carry around pointing at the birds and just overall not really fun to work with that lens. Personally, I'm not loving having a really heavy, expensive big lens, but I like the images I get out of it, so I'm happy to compromise in that regard. But I'm also doing a lot of photography where I can be stationary in one spot. If I was walking around all the time, I would definitely look at getting a lighter, more flexible lens. Are you currently looking at upgrading your lens or buying a new lens? What lenses are you looking at? Please let me know in the comments. Also, what lens are you currently using? And what's your dream lens? I would love to have a nice discussion about lenses and gear in general down there in the comments. Are you going to look at the new Canon lenses, the f11, 600 and 800mm? I'm actually quite interested in finding out how they perform because they seem like a really inexpensive option if they actually can perform in the field. So let me know in the comments all your thoughts about lenses and what lenses you're looking at the moment. Are you someone that sticks to Canon, Nikon or Sony lenses, or happy to use third-party lenses like a Sigma or Tamron? Let me know in the comments. All in all, I hope you enjoyed this video and that I could give you some more insight into bird photography and why I think an f4 600mm lens is the ultimate lens for bird photography. So I'm looking forward to talking to you in the comments. I appreciate the thumbs up for this video, and if you subscribe to the channel right down there, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!